Charlotte Podcast Festival is presented by Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, Eclex Creative Agency, and WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the home of acclaimed podcast Charlotte Talks, She Says, The List, Amplifier, Southbound, and FAQ City. Learn more about WFAE and our latest podcast, Work It, at WFAE.org.
I am Bernadette Joy. I am the founder at Crush Your Money Goals. And today we're going to talk about budgeting, generally speaking, but more specifically, how do we apply this to our podcast endeavors? If you want to connect with me afterwards, you can find me at crushyourmoneygoals.com. And our mantra at crushyourmoneygoals.com is to live on your own terms, not your loan terms. And interestingly, this business was entirely credited. I can say that it was entirely started because of my podcast. And so to give you a little bit more background, 2 years ago, I started a podcast. It was called The Bernadebt Joy Show. And the first season was called Crush This Debt. And that evolved over the years. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in my presentation, to turn into a full-fledged business, quit my day job, and this is what I do for a living now. And a lot of it started with just the idea of putting my story out in podcast format. And we have done 3 seasons so far. The first season, as I mentioned, was called Crush This Debt. And that season was 10 episodes. It was dropped Netflix style because I only have so much attention span. All of the episodes are 20 minutes or less, and it documents the story of how my husband and I paid off $72,000 of debt in a year on our student loans. And what I really loved about that project was that it was more of an audio journal. So it wasn't the traditional format of like interview style. We really took a lot of time to make it sound more like an audio book with like sound effects and a lot more production than I am capable of doing. And so that was a really fun project. Season 2, I shifted to the more traditional format of interview style. And on that season, I also started making money on my podcast. And that is where I invited other experts to talk about their tips on how to crush debt and how to save money. And so that was a really fun season. I also turned that into a YouTube series. And then I thought I was done with podcasting, to be honest. I was like, my initial thought was I was just going to do the 1 season. And then I had just happened to do the 2nd season because I still had some steam left. But then what ended up happening was I had my day job was a business called Dress, which was a local dress rental business here in Charlotte. And I decided to close that business, which was a really tough decision. And there were so many learnings that I had from closing that business, and invited other entrepreneurs to talk about the struggles that we've had and really dealing with the social pressure of entrepreneurship. So, and we are currently in progress to do season 4, which is going to go back to my roots of one person, scripted, and it's going to be called Dear Bernadebt Joy. And I'm going to be answering questions that people have asked about money and finances. And actually, Sarah has been helping me produce it, and you may hear Sarah's voice on it. So how Crush Your Money Goals got started with the podcast is that, I will be honest, when I first started the podcast, my intention was to call it F This Debt. But then I figured out that was really hard for marketing purposes. And so we ended up changing the name of the podcast to Crush This Debt. And it turned out, when I looked in hindsight of all the things that people would consistently ask me for in terms of tips on saving money or building a business, it followed these 5 steps, and it happened to spell out the word crush. By the way, this also applies for anything other than podcasting. This applies for any financial decision. The first thing is cultivating a new and positive money mindset. That's what C stands for. R stands for reverse engineer your goals. U stands for use your resources efficiently. S stands for spend on what you love and spend on what matters. And then H, the good old-fashioned hustle, hustle, hustle. And these steps are in order on purpose, because what I often find, and this is especially true in podcasting, I would say, is that people will skip over the first 4 steps and go straight to like the hustle, hustle, hustle. How do I make money? That's the first question I always get from people about podcasts, like, how do you make money making a podcast? But I'm really a proponent that these first 4 steps have to come before you do the hustle part. So the first step, cultivating a new money mindset. What do I mean by this? What I mean by cultivating a new money mindset is really understanding what your relationship with money is and how any of those positive or negative thoughts might be impacting your ability to make money, and in particular, monetize your podcast. There are 2 kinds of costs. There are expenses, which is simply the cost required to do something or the money that you're going to spend on something. And so, that's like everything under the sun. Are you really focused on what we call investments, which is the action or process of spending money for profit or material result, right? And what I often find is that people confuse the 2, and they're not the same thing. Just because you're spending money doesn't mean you're going to make money. And just because it's going to cost you money doesn't mean that you shouldn't spend it. And right before this session, I was going back and forth with a potential partner. And so the conversation that I've had to have with them is like, I understand like $1,000 is like no chump change for sure. I know what your business is. I know this because I used to be your client. And this is why I would promote your business, because I actually believe in what you do. So really, if you think about it that way, if you just get one client from this, every other client from that is pure profit. And they were like, oh, I never thought about it that way, which is unsurprising because financial advisors aren't marketers, right? And so, but I started the podcast because when my husband and I paid off the $72,000 of debt, I got a flood of DMs and emails asking to like take me out for cups of coffee, to quote unquote pick my brain on how we did that. And I came home to my husband one day and I said, this is getting really tiring, saying the same thing over and over again. I wish I could just record how we did this and then just send it to people. And then I wouldn't have to go to like all these cups of coffee. Also, because I'm a crazy introvert and it's like takes a lot of energy out of me. And he said, that's called a podcast, right? And I was like, oh, is that what a podcast is? And so that's why I did the podcast. Initially was just to save time in my own life. I had no intention of monetizing. I had no intention of turning into a business. And so it's totally okay if you're going into this podcast as a hobby, if you just really enjoy it. I thoroughly actually just enjoy sharing my message with people. And it makes me so happy when someone says to me, I listened to your podcast and it helped me pay off debt. If you are thinking of turning this into any sort of, profitable product, then you want to start treating it as a business from the very beginning. If you're not an engineer, this concept is simple, is that a lot of people start out with the idea of like where they are and then where they want to be and work up to that point. And I challenge you to think about the opposite. Where do you want to be with this podcast and work backwards from it, right? The 3 ways that I have personally used my podcast, aside from having an outlet to talk without actually having to like see people, is as a channel to build your brand and create awareness around your business or your message. Is, WCNC reached out to me and said, we heard your story. Someone listened to your podcast and told us about your story. Would you want to come and be on our, Charlotte Today, on our TV show? And I was like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. And so I went on the TV show, but they introduced me as podcaster Bernadette Joy. And I was like, oh, I'm a podcaster now. Yes, I have a podcast. I didn't consider myself a podcaster. And that in of itself, from the podcast, went to help build my brand on the TV station. Then the TV station started asking me to be a regular on that. And then they started asking me to do primetime stuff. And then NBC picked up what I was doing on the local thing, and it started building from there, right? But is there a way for you to take the content of the podcast itself and be able to use that content in order to sell what you've got going on? So I've also had people who've been willing to pay to be on my podcast, which was so interesting to me. And then lastly, and I started talking about this as a lead magnet into your other products or services. So using the podcast as a way for you to have visibility into your brand, but can it be a way to get people introduced to what you do so that they are more interested in what other kinds of things you can offer them? And so there's a lot of people, and I've been on panels with other folks, right, in this Charlotte Podcast Festival. By the way, I'll plug, go check out, like Sarah said, go check out all those other sessions. That many of the people have the podcast as a way to engage people in a way that is authentic and is part of their brand, but can lead them into their business. And the next piece is which is using your resources efficiently. And the first thing I will say, above all else, if you get nothing else out of this, is to at least create a monthly budget on your podcast. And all those little things that you would actually need to create your podcast will add up over time if you are really like dedicated to the art. I am even more important to me than money is time and energy. And so the title of this session is Don't Spend It All in One Place. Yes, we are here to talk about money, but to me, it's not worth saving the money if it's going to cost you significantly on time and energy. And so there's two places that you will often look at in terms of where you're going to spend your time, energy, and money. One is on producing the product itself, meaning the actual podcast. So everything from the equipment, the production, the materials, and editing. And then the promotion part of it, which is what I've learned actually through this podcast festival, is that many podcasters do in fact go into podcasting because they just thoroughly enjoy podcasting, but then are very averse to the promotion side. But if you want to get listeners, it's a necessary evil of doing some promotion, and that can include marketing, advertising, social media, public relations, and placement. If you just thoroughly enjoy a part of the podcasting process, and that's something you would be doing anyway because you just get a kick out of it, then I would not recommend outsourcing that. But if there's something that you don't enjoy, then that is where I do recommend that you spend some money and you save yourself the time and energy so that you can stay on the podcast for the long haul. Obviously, just your whole setup, the microphone setup, the headphones, Sarah is a great example of what that should look like right now. It doesn't cost a lot of money, but it will save you a lot of time in the editing process later on if you have the right equipment in place. I also would not shy away from getting a membership into, an existing podcasting studio. They are already well set up. The reason that I am part of the Queen City Podcast Network, plug for the Queen City Podcast Network, is because they know what they're doing. Another one I would suggest is either getting a Acuity or Calendly. I happen to use Acuity, but those are both scheduling tools that if you are going to have a podcast with guests on your show, then it makes it super easy to not have to go through the whole rigmarole of when are you available? When are you available? But if it's not for him, my podcast would have sounded like crap. I'm going to be honest with you. He did such great work in terms of sound engineering and really challenging me to kind of push the envelope on what we were doing from a quality perspective. And so even though it might cost you some money up front, the product will be that much better if you have someone who knows what they're doing. And then on the promotion side, and this is the piece where I actually have chosen not to outsource because I actually just thoroughly enjoy promotions and marketing. Canva is my favorite tool. I use it on a daily basis. This entire presentation was made on Canva. It is a really great, easy way if you do not want to hire a graphic designer to do your art or do your social media stuff, to be able to do your own graphics, and it looks really nice. Facebook ads in the very beginning, in order to, just get some traction, I absolutely bought some Facebook ads just so I could see, and it was more so even just from the targeting aspect to see if I tried different segments, who was actually clicking on it, and it gave me a good sense of who my target audience would be, and that helped me tailor my content going forward. And again, Facebook ads are relatively inexpensive, especially nowadays during COVID time that people can't see anyone in person, that if you want people to kind of understand what your credibility is, those images really make a difference. And then video, I actually have someone who does my videography for me, and I have done videos of my podcast episode. So we'll record the podcast episode in the studio, and he'll also be recording it on video. And I've taken those videos and be able to use that to promote both the podcast and my brand overall. And why I say hustle, hustle, hustle 3 times is because I don't think there's any one right way to do any of this stuff. But if you, by the way, this is all talking about things you should, you could spend your money on, but I also wanted to give you some options of how you can get about this for free if you're not ready for the investment yet, on how you can build your own platform. And so the first thing that I will just say right off the bat is the easiest thing that you can do is to just be a guest on other podcasts. Look out for those other podcasts. And I was just talking about this with Joni right before the call, but the podcasting community is one of those few places that it's not competitive, as in just because someone listens to my podcast doesn't mean they're going to not listen to your podcast. If anything, it's the other way around. If someone likes my podcast, then it benefits you to be on my podcast so that you can get a similar audience. And so consider this a community, just how WFAE has brought us all together for this podcast festival. I'm sure, like, even in this chat box right now, you can go in there and say, like, hey, who has an interesting story and wants to be in my podcast? And you'd be surprised at how many people are willing to do that. Right now, as we speak, I have someone who is transcribing my podcast for me. And I'm paying her to do it because I don't want to do it, right? But I'm having her transcribe these podcasts so that I can go back and look at the content and see what of this content can I then turn into an article for Time, or that I can then turn into a YouTube segment, or then I can bring as a possible segment for local television. Having a regular marketing schedule and just getting consistent with what you want to do. And it doesn't have to be crazy. Like, I'm on a daily schedule with my social media, but even I think that's too much. And so even if you get on a regular schedule of doing like a weekly, like one weekly email or one social media podcast, if promotion is not your thing, just putting yourself on a schedule will help reduce some of the I don't want to do it. If you liked this session, then I would invite you to come to see me in other things that I do. You can, in fact, consult with me if you want to talk about your, how you want to brand your podcast. I have a lot of clients that I help. One of my clients is another podcaster who is another speaker on this Charlotte Podcast Festival. You can also check out my membership. I have my Crush Your Money Goals membership, where we are not only talking about business and stuff, but how do you actually manage all of your finances so that you can do the things you like podcasting. You can take a Skill Pop class with me. I teach 5 classes a month. I will also put in a plug for Andy Go's podcast class. He teaches on Skill Pop as well, and that's actually how I met him, and he became my producer. It's a great class. Please check out my podcast, Dear Bernadebt Joy podcast, particularly the first season. It's my favorite. And if you search my name on Google, Bernadebt Joy, you can find free articles from other outlets and videos and stuff just on my story.
This one is from Nikki. How do you suggest getting rid of the garbage regarding your attitude about money?
Oh, yes. Great question. Just to lay it all out, like literally write down on a piece of paper, what are all of the reasons or excuses that you're telling yourself that you don't want to monetize this. And I find this especially true with my female clients. I read an article yesterday that was about a founder who got ousted out. It was on Inc. I'm forgetting the name of the founder right now, but it was on Inc. And she got ousted from her own startup after they raised all this money, and it was valued at $50 million. And she said one of the things that it was a real struggle for her, and as a female, was that while men went out into these businesses and said they were not apologetic at all, and in fact was considered a strength that they are here to make money, all of the women founders, even though they had multi-million-dollar businesses, they had to go in media and stuff and talk about I'm here to help people, or this is why my business is sustainable or has a mission and all that stuff. And yes, that is absolutely all important. I don't suggest you go out and not have a mission and just go out and make all the money, but we shouldn't apologize for wanting to make money, right? And it doesn't make you greedy. It doesn't make you selfish. Wanting to support your family and secure your financial future is actually a very good thing, in my opinion. And so I would suggest to write down all the reasons, all the excuses that you kind of told yourself as to why you have this mental block around making money, and then write the reason, reframe that to say, okay, instead of saying this, I'm going to tell myself this, and then actually go out and look for content that supports the more positive approach versus the excuse that you've told yourself.
Good advice. Megan asks, how did you determine where, how much, and when to make investments in your podcast when your podcast wasn't making money?
Great question. So the first thing that I thought of is like, what do I really don't want to do? Like, even with all the excuses, I was like, okay, I just literally don't want to do this. And so the reason that I decided to go out and get the first investment I made was to hire someone to do the podcast for me. But that comes at the opportunity cost of me working on other pieces of my business that do make money and that I make more money doing, and the time that it would take me to learn it, the learning curve and the product in return probably wouldn't be as good. And so I'm so glad I did it. I was like, well, let me go find someone who knows what they're doing, and I don't have to spend all this time on the learning curve, and the product will be better faster than I would have done it myself. And so my first suggestion to you is to look at the areas where you think you're going to spend an inordinate amount of time or energy. And if there is a resource that would accomplish that faster and better than you could, it's worth considering putting the investment in.
So Kelly asks, can you lose credibility by accepting money from guests?
I mean, I think you would lose credibility if you didn't disclose it, yes. And I also think you would lose credibility if you are accepting money from people who are not aligned with your brand. So if you go to my Instagram, actually the post that I posted yesterday, this is a true story, is in the last month, I have gotten offers to promote like various financial services, like workout clothes, luxury watches. And just this past week, I got an offer for a large sum of money to promote a very well-known credit card brand. And I turned down every single offer because none of those partnerships make sense with what I do. And like my immediate response was to the credit card company. I was like, do you not see what I do for a living? Like, this doesn't make any sense. I said it in a nice way, right? But I was like, I literally cannot, I would not and cannot promote that because it is entirely against what I teach, right? So I think the question is not of whether or not you accept money. The question or not is if you are really being true to what your messaging is. And here's the other thing too, is that for me, I will also say the opposite for me is true, is that if I continue to do what I do with the amount of work that I put into it and I kept doing it for free, that would also be against what I teach. Because what I teach in my classes is to tell, and especially women, to get what you're worth, right? So I say this all the time. I did not become debt free. I did not pay off $300,000 of debt in 3 years by working for free.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you so much. And that is all the time we have for the Q&A. Thank you for everyone who submitted questions. And let's give a big round of applause for Bernadette Joy.